Hi, ladies. Okay, so this is our decolonization lecture number 2, and our do now starts with looking at similar maps that we saw in lecture 1. So these are maps E and F. So looking at these, describe the changes that took place between 1959 in map E and 1974 in map F. So looking at this, you can probably start to see hopefully that a lot of this colonization that we see in this region has now started to become even less and less. And I want you to think about what major historical events occurred between 1914, so that was the previous map, and 1974. So what's really happening that could explain how these events could have caused the changes depicted in the map? This question is still asking about that historical circumstances. So if you were to look at, 1959 and you were to say, what were the historical circumstances that led to the creation of this map? That would be a perfect question for CRQ. All right, so today we are going to take a look at the development of India's independence from Great Britain and the impact this independence has had on the conflict between India and Pakistan. This lecture is going to be a 2-day lesson, so this is going to take us between the Tuesday and the Wednesday. So let's get started talking about decolonization in India. So Gandhi is stated as saying, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So in World War I, we see the weakening of the British Empire, and this is when the independence movement for India begins. So India started fighting for their independence really towards the end of World War I. They're still not going to gain it until 1949, but they do start very early. And it's led by both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. The Muslim League was created to kind of protect the Muslims, as it says right in its name, from being persecuted or being forgotten by the Hindu dominated Indian National Congress. Now, these two groups are going to become very influential in India's history because the Muslim League is going to eventually start asking for their own separate state of Pakistan. Britain promised India self-rule in 1919, and the Government of India Act transferred powers over farming, public works, and education. And we see this happen a lot in these types of situations where decolonization and independence movements began, is that slowly but surely Britain would give them, okay, we'll give you some self-rule. And they would give them some information over certain areas, but they wouldn't give them full control over the government. And they typically gave them things like farming and public works, education. They let them have control over small, minor details of a government without the actual government itself. And despite their promises and desire for self determination, which again was a big part of Wilson's 14 points, they pretty much were ignored the calls for self rule. Okay, and we have to remember that self determination is the idea that the government of that nation was chosen by those people. So, that idea of self determination, the self will determine, the country will determine the type of government. All of these video clips are going to be featured into the Independence in India Google form extra credit. So, I'm going to flip past them very quickly. In 1919, you had the anti-British protests that began sweeping across India, one of which was the Armistar massacre. And during that time, it was a peaceful, non-violent protest. British troops went in and fired upon about a few thousand Indians that were protesting, and about 400 of them were killed. Now, in Armistar, and you will see this in the video clip in the extra credit, they were in a completely walled little area. So these Indians were sitting in there protesting, peaceful protest, as was Gandhi's major focus. And the British basically blocked off the only exit and fired into the crowd. It was impossible for these Indians to really get out and to be taken care of and to be safe. And I do highly recommend that you go in and watch that clip. So here we have Gandhi, and these demands for independence are going to be led by Gandhi, right? And every time we see images of Gandhi, we tend to see him in this very traditional Hindu Indian style clothing, and that is a big part of his homespun movement. So Gandhi was an advocate for nonviolence, and he believed that using violence was a way of being kind of like below that society. So when he was looking at nonviolence, he tried to look at it as attaining the moral high ground, which basically meant that he believed that India would gain independence by making the British look foolish, by making the British look that they had little to no morality and they were mistreating the Indians. And he also practiced civil disobedience, where he believed that if there was a law that was unjust, it was your right to break that law because that law should not exist. An eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. That is a very famous quote from Gandhi, and it pops up a lot. I am prepared to die, but there is no cause for which I am prepared to kill. Nonviolence requires a double faith, faith in God and also faith in man. Nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man. So when we are talking about Gandhi, who believes so strongly in nonviolence, that he does not tell any of the Indians to put any hands like on British men, on British soldiers, on Indians who were fighting for the British. He said, there's no cause at which there should be anyone who should be harming another Britishman. From 1920 to 1922, Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, and what he did was Indians just refused to cooperate with the British. They refused to do things that were supportive of British. They boycotted British goods. They boycotted British institutions. They refused to work for British companies, and they basically were like, "We're going to sit here, and we're just not going to cooperate until you wake up and leave." Non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as it is cooperation with good. And here we have that homespun movement. So, in that homespun movement, he encouraged Indians to boycott British textiles. He encouraged them to make their own clothing. He was known to have traveled with his own small spinning wheel, which is the what you see on the left of that image, so that he could make his own clothing. He lived by example. He did not use violence against anybody, no matter how much violence was used against him. He made his own clothing. He anything that he asked of and the other Indians, he asked and also completed of himself. He dreamt very simply, even though he was fairly wealthy, to show sympathy of the poor. And he saw this spinning wheel as symbolizing his ideals, symbolizing what he thought would come from India. All right. Gandhi was a very wealthy Indian. He was educated in Great Britain. He was a lawyer. He was very well to do, but he dressed very simply and acted very simply because he did advocate for the poor. He is going to lead a 230-mile march to the sea, protesting the British monopoly on salt. This is going to become known as the Salt March. It's one of Gandhi's most famous testaments against the British, and he uses it in a way to kind of gain moral support against the British. And you're going to see that in the video clips that are posted for you in your Independence in India Google form extra credit. Gandhi was also famous for using hunger strikes. So Gandhi was imprisoned several times, and every time that he was imprisoned, he would go on a hunger strike. And when he would go on a hunger strike, the British would immediately release him. And he did this to draw attention to his cause. He did this to force the British to reform what they were doing. The British could not afford to be the ones who killed Gandhi. So every time he started going on a hunger strike or said he would go on a hunger strike, they immediately released him because they did not want anything bad to happen to Gandhi while he was in their care. He did embrace the Western notions of democracy and nationalism. He uses them both. He uses Indian nationalism to gain their independence, to rile Indians together, but he does reject industrialization as basically immoral. He does believe that that's not a system that India should be using. Gandhi also opposed the caste system. He urged equal rights for women. He hoped for equality and cooperation among Hindus and Muslims. And this last part is what's going to end up eventually becoming, the biggest issue for Gandhi is that he wants this equality and this cooperation among Hindus and Muslims, but he's not really able to gain it. And that's going to be a huge issue for him. And that's where we're going to see the start of that issues between India and Pakistan. World War II, further continues to weaken the British Empire, just like we saw in Africa and in Southeast Asia, is that World War II is really going to set the tone for the rest of the world that now is the time to decolonize. Now is the time to ask for independence. And we're going to have a man named Nehru who is going to be Gandhi's successor. And he's going to work with Gandhi, who really calls for a separate, independent India. All right, we need to separate from the British and we need to work hard to do so. Muhammad al Jinnah is going to be leader of the Muslim League. He works with Gandhi and Nehru in the understanding that they need to gain independence from Britain, but he completely separates and rejects Nehru's idea of a united India. He does not want to have one united India. He believes that Muslims need their own separate nation, a separate nation where they will be able to be safe and they will not be in a risk from each other. And if you see in here, you can take a look at the percentages that you are seeing. So the majority of Hindus did live in India. And you can see in the northern region of what is going to become Pakistan, there are a lot more Muslims. And he really did call and desire that that region needed to be separated into a separate nation. And Jinnah calls for a day of direct action, which led to a lot of violence, about 6,000 killed. And he did believe that it was necessary for these two nations to be separated. So what we are going to end up with is we are going to end up with West Pakistan and East Pakistan. In 1979, East Pakistan will become Bangladesh, and we're going to end up with India. So these two regions are going to be separated against both Nehru and Gandhi, who really strongly wanted a united India. So in 1947, Britain gave India its independence, and they did portion the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. But they mostly separated this line along religion. And as we've seen in the past, when we saw how Europeans have drawn lines before for nations, this doesn't always work out. And India and Pakistan are going to have conflict because of those lines that were drawn. The partition is going to force 12 million Hindus and Muslims to migrate, and that migration is going to cause terrible violence between Hindus and Muslims, and about 500,000 are going to be killed initially during that first migration. In 1948, Gandhi is assassinated by a fellow Hindu who rejected his views of Hindu-Muslim unity. Gandhi is praying, and the Hindu nationalist walks up and shoots Gandhi almost point blank. He is almost immediately captured and executed. So looking at this region, so let's talk about the geographical context for the historical developments shown on this map. So we have a disputed area in the northern region. And basically, when we were looking at a question like this, we were asking ourselves, how does the geography of India and Pakistan impact the creation of the disputed area? Pakistan and India remain bitter enemies today. Both nations claim this region of Kashmir, which is controlled by India but has a Muslim majority. So we see a northern region of Kashmir. Now, the majority of people that do live there are Muslim. However, it is owned by India. Now, the simple solution would be to say, well, India should just give it over to Pakistan. But India is looking at it as a very, this was mine. I shouldn't have to give this up. So they're not going to do that by the simple fact that this was given to us. So therefore, why should I have to give it to you? And when you watch the video, the Vice video that talks about the world's most dangerous borders, you can see that it is a very dangerous spot in the world. In India, which is the world's most populous democracy, for the first 40 years, the Nehru family led the Indian government. So it's going to be led by the person who succeeded Gandhi. So we have Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the prime minister from 1947 to 64. You have his wife, Indira Gandhi, from 66 to 1984. And then you have Rajiv Gandhi, prime minister, from 1984 to 1989. Oh, sorry, Indira Gandhi is Nehru's daughter. I don't know why I said wife. She was prime minister. She is going to be assassinated though by a Sikh bodyguard because frankly, her policies start to upset a lot of Muslims living in India. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, who is the next prime minister, is also assassinated in 1991. And you have to remember that during the Cold War, India is not aligned. And they did this so that they could receive support from both sides. But also, as we saw with many during the Cold War, many former colonies did not want to pick a side because they saw picking a side as being very similar to being a colonized country again. So let's take a look at three of these major problems that you see between India and Pakistan. So we have the India-Pakistan War of 1965. This is their second conflict over the Jammu and the regions of Jammu and Kashmir. And India asks the UN to come in and step in and to to become involved. And the UN demands a ceasefire. Both sides give up claims, but both sides refuse to withdraw their armies. In 1999, you have the Kargil conflict. And this is when India is going to launch airstrikes against Pakistani forces that infiltrate the mountains in Kashmir. And Pakistani said these forces are freedom fighters. They're trying to liberate Jammu and Kashmir. And both sides are claiming victory. But as we've seen historically in the past, it's very hard for two groups to both say that they won. And in 2008, you have the Mumbai terror attacks. And many of people refer to this as India's 9/11. 10 Pakistani men killed 184 Indians in Mumbai. Nine of them were killed during the attacks, and then the surviving gunman was executed in November 2012. Now, this Vice video goes over not only the regions of Kashmir, but it also is going to go over and discuss the issues that are going on between North and South Korea. So, highly recommend to continue to watch for the entirety of the episode. Your documents homework deals with India's partition. Part of the thing that I want to make sure that you do is that documents A and B, you're going to respond to questions for those documents. Plus, was it a good idea at the time based on just documents A and B in that historical context? So, just thinking about what they knew at that time in the 1940s. And then documents C and D. Now, looking at it from a more modern phase, from a later on time period, was this still a good idea? Your success criteria is on the side, and when you are done, obviously turn in your homework. Like I said, this is going to be a 2-day lesson, so you will have opportunities both Tuesday and Wednesday to complete not only this lecture, but to work on the uh, extra credit. If you have any questions, as always, please join our Google Meets from 12:30 to 1 every weekday, or shoot me a message in the group chat, or send me an email. Stay safe.